Welcome to Understanding Islam. This week we're going to be looking at peace, jihad and war. This is the 10th episode of the third series of Understanding Islam, which is called Building a Just Society. So let me just begin by reminding you that if you have missed any of the previous episodes, you can go to the Ahlul Bayt TV on demand section on the website and you'll find them all there. And also, if you want to go to my own website, you will find there an article that accompanies each of these programs, and you can also find the video recordings of the programs there as well. So when we hear of peace talks going on somewhere around the world, or we can hear about a peacemaking delegation, what's the meaning of the word peace here? Well, often it just means a cessation of violence. We're going to stop the fighting here. But is that real peace? Is that peace according to Islamic understanding? If we go right back to the very beginning of understanding Islam, and we remember that we had that three-letter root, SLM, and from this root we formed the three words Islam, Muslim and Salam. And that root has with it a whole range of meanings. The meanings of justice, safety, security, balance, due order, harmony, everything in its right place. And as far as the human being is concerned, obedience to the divine will. So this then is the meaning of the root. So when we talk of salam, peace, we're meaning a state of justice, balance, security, everything obeying God, everything in its rightful place. And so peace cannot come about just by people stopping fighting. Peace, salam, actually requires that we establish justice upon the earth. It means that we and all people and the whole of creation are brought under the divine guidance and live the way that God, the great creator, intended. And then true peace can reign. If we are thinking about the conditions of establishing peace within our own life, we can see that this is not going to be something that's easy. Temptation is something that's real. We are tempted to do things that we know we really ought not to do. Sin is something that's real. It's rebellion against the will of God. And so therefore, there's a struggle that's involved here. We're all born in a state of harmony with God. We're all born Muslim. But that state doesn't last long once society starts to get hold of us, because society can tempt us and push us and lead us astray in different ways. So from the very beginning, we need to be trained according to the ways of God, and we need to learn self-discipline. We need to learn struggling in the way of God. Now, in addition to that, we have the tempter, because the Quran tells us about the existence of a third form of life called the jinn. Now, one of the jinn, called Iblis, commits the ultimate sin of rebellion against God. He says, I know better than you know. So he sets his judgment up against the judgment of God. And of course he loses, because God is all-powerful. God will win at the end. And yet Iblis has pledged himself to spend the whole of time tempting human beings to get them to rebel against God. So the temptation of Iblis is a real factor in the life of a Muslim and therefore of every human being. So we can see life as a struggle between the temptations of Iblis, the temptations from society to go astray and to live in ungodly ways, and against the pull of our own lower selves that want us to go away from the path of Islam and to do something that we know that isn't really right. This struggle, if we put it into Arabic, is the word jihad. Jihad means to struggle and to strive. And if you think about somebody going up a hill and really struggling and striving to go up the hill, puffing and panting and so on, then that is somebody who is performing jihad, a real struggle. It's an inner struggle within my own self, first of all. Because if I'm not struggling to overcome sin in my own life, then I'm going to be no use at trying to overcome sin in the outer society in which we live. So jihad is first of all an inner struggle against my own waywardness, against my own weakness, my laziness, my arrogance, my sense of self-sufficiency. I don't need anyone, I don't need God. There was one occasion recorded in the histories in which Prophet Muhammad, with a group of his early community from Medina, was coming back from having seen off a raiding party. So they'd been out to fight them off and send them on their way. And he said to his companions as he was returning, "We are now returning from the lesser jihad, that is, fighting off the enemy, to the greater jihad, that is, fighting our own waywardness, our own lower tendencies." So this is the great jihad in the life of every single Muslim. And if one wants to be a Muslim, one has to say this jihad is compulsory. It needs to be engaged upon, because otherwise we're going to slide backwards away from the way of God. Now, this is where living in a Muslim society can be very useful, because the community give you some support. You're surrounded by other people who are also trying to live a Muslim way of life. And yet we have to live in the world in which we find ourselves. And so we have the saying that you are to live in this world around us, but not necessarily to accept its ways. Not necessarily to accept the standards and values of the world around us. So to be in the world, but not necessarily of the world. We can call this a kind of psychological withdrawal. I don't have to do what everybody else does in this society. It may be necessary that we actually make a physical withdrawal. We get up and move. It may be that we move house, that we move job, that we move the company that we keep, so that we are not drawn into ungodliness. It may even be that we have to get up and leave one country and go and live in another country. And so this inner struggle can become then an outer struggle as well. When we think about the transition from the inner struggle to the outer struggle, a Muslim is not allowed to just sit back idly and watch the world going in a bad direction, to watch evil take over and corrupt the society in which we live. We are required to promote the good and to forbid the evil, to struggle in a godly way, to bring the whole of society under the direction of God, and at the same time to oppose the march of evil, of corruption within society. The principal tool for doing this is to do justice, to stand up firm on the principle of justice. Indeed, we have a saying of Prophet Muhammad in which he said, "The greatest jihad is to speak the word of truth into the face of the tyrant. And so this stand on the principle of godliness, of justice and truth is a very important part of Muslim living in community, in society, and is a requirement, even ultimately at the cost of one's own life. Because if one doesn't resist the onward march of evil, then evil wins and evil takes over and pollutes and corrupts our society. When we think about doing good starts in all sorts of small ways. Smiling at somebody when we meet them, being the first to greet them, removing some stone or some obstacle from the pavement so as to make it easier for other people to walk along there, visiting the sick, taking care of other people. It can be opposing the evil in small ways too, correcting people when we hear them saying things that are untrue about somebody else, stopping gossiping and backbiting. It can be actually campaigning within society to get society to move in a more godly direction. And Islamic tradition has it that there are 3 levels then of this action within society. First of all, if we encounter something that is wrong, we should change it by action if we can. We should do something about it. If you see something wrong happening in front of you, it's your responsibility not to just turn and walk away, but actually to try to help. Now, that may not be possible, so then we go to the second level, and this is actually opposing the evil through talking, through writing, through campaigning, being actively engaged in the ways of society, joining in political campaigns, taking up the pen and writing articles, writing petitions, campaigning, speaking against things, so that we are struggling in this way, part of our jihad, to make the world a better place. And then at the third level, we have not allowing this evil to take place, to take root in our hearts. But then the Prophet goes on to say, be aware that this is the weakest form of jihad, the weakest form of opposing the evil, because all you're doing is stopping it from taking root in your own heart. Muslims are active citizens, getting involved in the life of the society in which they live, being engaged in political life, being engaged in charitable work, being engaged in voluntary work to improve the lot of people within society, being engaged also in community projects and so on, because in this way they are struggling to promote good within society and to oppose the onward march of evil. And even if we are not able to achieve all the good that we want, the mere fact that one is struggling in this way is an act of taqwa. It is an act of God consciousness. It raises our awareness of God in every action of life. Now, the painful reality of life is that all our campaigning and demonstrating and writing may actually not be sufficient. So then the question is what to do when the forces of evil are taking over within society. What to do literally when evil is marching down the street, carrying the banners of racism, of injustice, of tyranny, of oppression of the poor, and so on. Well, the Muslim counsel here is that after everything else has been tried, it is not a question of peace at any cost. It may be that you actually have to resist the onward march of evil by taking up arms and opposing it by force. And this then becomes the jihad of legitimate force. here is the most serious activity in which any human being can engage in, because you are talking about being prepared to take the life of another human being. This is much too important just to be left to human whim. This must be conducted according to the guidance of God, according to God's laws, not human beings' laws or whims. And so 5 principles are set down for the conduct of a jihad. First of all, it must be the last resort. Everything else must have been tried first. Secondly, we must use minimum force, only that which is required to repel the evil forces should be used. Thirdly, it must be a defensive activity. You can only use jihad in order to defend oneself, one's own community, in order to go to the defense of another community who are being opposed by tyranny in some way, or to oppose the destruction of the Islamic way of life. Now, the Islamic way of life is the fundamental way for human beings to live their lives, and so not to oppose something that is going to destroy that is actually just to give in to human degradation. There must be a good chance of success, and it must be a collective effort. It's not just the work of a small group. And finally, a jihad must be called by legitimate authority. Now, this is problematic because in earlier times, legitimate authority was the caliph who was able to call the jihad and nobody else. In modern times, some Muslim scholars say, well, it could be the leader of a Muslim nation. Other scholars say, well, the state of Muslims in the world today is in such a state of disarray that nobody has the authority legitimately to call a jihad. The important thing then is it must be called by legitimate authority and not just by anybody who is a self-appointed leader. When it comes to fighting, whether it is fighting in jihad or fighting in war, there are rules of engagement. Now, these rules of engagement were set down according to the teaching of the Quran and of the Prophet in the very earliest period of Islam, and therefore they govern all fighting. First of all, the rule is one of minimum force. Secondly, war or fighting is to be between combatants. Today we would say between men in uniform. And so you must distinguish between combatants and non-combatants. Non-combatants include all women, children, the sick, the elderly, the soldier who has just thrown down his weapons, and also those who live in religious establishments, monasteries, hermitages, places like that. They must not be attacked, they must not be intimidated, they must not be killed. They are non-combatants. So you must discriminate in your fighting between combatants and non-combatants. That means that you must discriminate in the type of weaponry that you use as well. So things that bring about a human or ecological disaster, things which are indiscriminate in their effect, are forbidden. They must not be used. Now, in 7th century terms, that means you're not allowed to poison a water supply, you're not allowed to burn food crops, either in the field or in the barn, and you're not allowed to cut down trees. In 21st century terms, these would be weapons of mass destruction. These would be chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons. They are by their nature indiscriminate. they are also by their nature causing huge ecological and human damage, and therefore they are immoral and illegal according to the Islamic teaching. Now, if we think then of the rules of engagement being used in this way, in a legitimately called jihad by legitimate authority, with all those other principles in place, then it is a duty which ultimately can fall upon every adult male Muslim. There is a verse in the Quran that says, even that which you hate the most, even that which you detest, can be called from you by the will of God. And so every adult male Muslim can ultimately be required to take up arms and to join in the jihad. Why? Because ultimately, if one does not resist in this way, one allows evil to take over and pollute the whole of human society. Now, it's important to remember then that jihad is by its nature a defensive action. You are defending your community, the Islamic way of life, defending the defenseless against tyrannical oppression. So therefore, a jihad cannot be a war of territorial gain, trying to take over new lands and bring them under Islamic rule. That has happened in Islamic history, and that's what we call war. So trying to acquire new territory is war and not jihad. Two different things. Now, that's not to say that at times in human history that some territorial wars have been called jihads, and it's not to say either that at times in Islamic history the rules of engagement have been broken. Let us remember that some Muslim majority countries in the world today, I think immediately of Pakistan, actually hold nuclear weapons. Now, we have seen that the Islamic principles, the rules of engagement, would regard all discriminate killing as being unacceptable in Islam. And so you can see that the politicians here in Pakistan are struggling with that same moral dilemma which faces many other countries around the world. We pray that we never have to use this thing, but we feel that we need it in order to act as a deterrent against those who would attack us. And then there's a discussion that goes on amongst the scholars, just as there is amongst Christian scholars looking at just war theory. Is it possible that these weapons could ever be used morally, according to the just war theory, according to the rules of engagement in Islam? And that discussion is ongoing. Join me next week when we're going to be looking at martyrdom and self-sacrifice in Islam. I look forward to seeing you then.